Okay, so moving into segmental behavior. Now this integrates with the last slide, looking at joint range of motion, because what are joints? Joints represent the interaction between segments. And so when we think of muscular loading, muscles pull on segments to create motion at a joint. So understanding how the segment is organized is really important to help us understand how the muscular tissue is experiencing forces. And so this will just give you a general guide to help you understand how and why we're organizing the trunk in a certain way, the femur in a certain way, and the shin in a certain way. So from a trunk standpoint, we can keep the trunk upright, we can approach 45 degrees, we can approach 90 degrees, where the trunk is more parallel to the ground. And this will influence the demand on the hip extensors and also the knee extensors and across the rest of the lower limb as well. You can't really consider how the trunk in isolation will influence the rest of the limb without also considering the rest of the limb, okay? And that's why we have to consider femoral and shin behavior as well. So when we're looking at femoral behavior, we're thinking of the femur above parallel. So this position number 1 would be above parallel. Position number 2 would be at parallel. And then position number 3 would be below parallel. Okay, that's going to influence the demand on the knee extensors, depending on the position of other segments and where you want to apply stress, but also relative to the trunk position as well. But you'll see how this will become much more practical when we get into the exercises and how we're using that to guide our progressions. And then we're looking at shin behavior, where number 1, we have a vertical shin. Number 2, we have the shin rotating forward relative to the foot, but we don't want the shin to rotate too far forward. We can generally think of the knee being over the toes or just slightly behind the toes, because as we bring that shin further in front of the toes, it's going to increase the demand on the knee extensors. It doesn't mean that number 3 is a bad position, but it's about understanding, will the individual be able to tolerate the extra demand on the knee in that position? Okay, so no position is good or bad. We have to understand how might it influence the demand on muscular tissues, and is the client ready to tolerate that extra demand? That's what's important, okay? But this gives us a general framework to guide how we're organizing segments across each progression. Okay, so now we're moving into local and coordinative knee loading strategies or concepts. So like we briefly discussed before, a local loading strategy, when the intention is on the knee, is about concentrating load into the knee itself. When we're concentrating load into the knee itself, we're considering the knee extensors, the knee flexors, but also within the context of this course and this program, we're considering the ankle plantar flexors. The proximal gastroc, for example, will have a plantar flexor or a knee flexor contribution as well. But also, for us, the plantar flexors will have a much greater impact on the local load tolerance of the knee as well. And then coordinatively, this is different to local because now we're trying to distribute load between the knee, the ankle, and the hip. And there's some very important reasons for that. One of the most important reason is that a coordinative loading strategy still gives us the opportunity to load the knee, but not to expose the knee to all the load on its own, which can be too much, too soon for a client who has been avoiding load at the knee for a prolonged period of time. But the reason this is important, because what a lot of practitioners will do, and you've probably seen this yourself, is that if it's painful to load the knee in isolation, what will often happen is they'll just load the hip in isolation. They'll just load the ankle in isolation, and they'll avoid the knee. Now, while the knee might get better, it doesn't get better because all of a sudden you fix something magic at the hip, but it's because you probably just avoided loading the knee. So if you don't load the knee, it's going to feel better until the client goes out and has to engage in an activity where the knee has to deal with some load. So it gives us the opportunity to gradually expose the knee in a coordinated manner. Now, alternatively, we could just lower the load locally at the knee. And we're going to show you how that is reflected in these pictures here. So just from a conceptual standpoint, let's say we have 150 units of force going into the lower limb. This is the ground reaction force, the external force. So your lower limb has to produce internal forces via muscular contractions to counteract that external force. Now, if we're looking at it from a coordinative standpoint, and we're looking at the knee within the context of the hip and the ankle, we want the hip to produce 50 units of internal force, the knee to contribute 50 units of force, and the ankle to contribute 50 units of force. They're all sharing the workload. Naturally, that's not going to happen because it depends on the task, but it's a conceptual reflection here. Locally, it would be a case where we want the knee to tolerate that 150 units of force in isolation and reduce the contribution from the hip and reduce the contribution from the ankle. So we're building that local tolerance to load at the knee. We're exposing it locally. We're not giving anything else the opportunity. This is really important because you could be doing a squatting strategy, for example, where you think the knee is doing a lot of work, but because the hip and the ankle are contributing, the knee isn't really dealing with all the forces. That can be really important when you're dealing with a client who has a long history of knee injuries or is very prone to avoiding the knee during more dynamic multi-joint activities that involve the hip, the knee, and the ankle. And so in the early phases, for example, you're not going to be concentrating 150 units of force into the knee. You can just simply lower the external load, and we'll show you how we can do that as well. So we're still, in this third picture here, we're still concentrating load into the knee locally, but we've just lowered the external load. So we're gradually exposing the client to higher and higher load locally, but we're still reducing the contribution from the hip and the ankle. Okay. Now, on those coordinative days that we showed you, where we're looking at the hamstrings, quads, the hamstrings, glutes, and calves. Alternatively, then we have the quads, glutes, and calves. So two separate coordinative days in phase 1. We need to consider, do we want to use something like this where we're getting the hip, the knee, and the ankle to all work together? That will be a coordinative loading strategy where we're getting all 3 joints and areas working together. We don't have to do that though. We can coordinate load between 1 to 2 joints. So we could have a situation here where we have 150 units of force going into the lower limb, but now we're coordinating load between the knee and the hip, and we're getting less contribution from the ankle. Alternatively, we can reduce the contribution from the hip and just start coordinating load between the knee and the ankle. Okay, and again, we have to determine, are we loading the knee extensors? Are we loading the knee flexors? Okay, so we have lots of options here. We have lots of options from a coordinative standpoint. We have lots of options from a local standpoint. The important thing is, though, is having the ability to address both. Okay, because sometimes you'll have clients that have great local load capacity around the knee, but when they engage in more multi-joint activities that involve the hip, the knee, and the ankle, they struggle to distribute that load more broadly. They struggle to actually share workload into the hip and into the ankle. That's a scenario where you may want to drive more coordinative strategies. In another situation, you may have an individual who is great at coordinating load across the hip, the knee, and the ankle, but they really struggle to handle load in isolation through the knee. Okay, so we need to have the ability to, number one, assess this by looking at subjective and objective features of the unique clients, but then we need to have options through which we can implement this into a rehab plan.